was the case study, and the title represented Improving Operations with Asset Management. That is a great title of an overall discussion. And today I'm going to focus specifically on the contract closeout process. The slides that I'm going to present today are my own slides as the chapter president of the Bay Area chapter of NPMA. They may or may not be, and are no reflection directly on what I do as Lockheed Martin Corporation that I work for in Sunnyvale, California. They're not proprietary, and there's nothing in there that you can or can't have. And so you can take those, and Jessica has provided those to you in the information as well. So Jessica, if you'll flip to the next chart, slide 2 for me, is really the presentation description that I put together. We've delivered the final product to our government customer, and the engineers are moving on to other jobs. The product was successful, time to celebrate. The customer is very happy. And then as we in asset management know, we've got work to do. We've got to follow that. We've got to make sure we get everything closed out correctly. And so I'm going to talk about more of that information in the next slides and what our responsibility are as contractors. And as Jessica mentioned in the poll questions, it sounds like we had 17% that was tied to doing contract closeout. Not a bad process, but there was 40% that needed some information. So hopefully this presentation today will help with that. So as I go to the next chart, which is the contractor's responsibility, this is a specific definition out of FAR 52245-1. And this is the key there is highlighted in blue, that the contractor's responsibility extends all the way through formally relieved of responsibility by authorized means and expanding the surplus property or disposition, or via completed investigation, evaluation, and final determination. So what does that really mean? Let's get to the next slide. What is contract closeout? Well, as you can read here on the slide, this was Aquipedia's definition. And I'll let you take a second to read that, because it may surprise you that it's not exactly the way we look at from the FAR. So really, if you notice in my takeaway at the bottom of the slide, the primary functional area is contracting, because it's a contract closeout, not just an asset or property management closeout. So what does that mean for us in property and asset management? As I go to the next chart, property closeout under the 52245-1 definition again, contractor shall promptly perform and report to the property administrator. All contracts, including reporting, investigating, etc. there. I won't repeat that. Again, you can read that. It's in the information in the FAR as well. So as I go to the next chart, when does property closeout really start? Does it really start at the period of performance when the delivery is completed, as I referenced in the session description? Or what about a final inventory or termination inventory? When does it start with PCAR submissions? A lot of discussion around that, and if you think about property closeout, we really aren't sure. So I'm going to go into a little bit more definition, and as I go to the next slide, we're going to define the period of performance. Is it clear? Not always. We know they change. There's some great references on the Ask a Professor page, and we've done some research on that, and look at FAR subpart 11.4, which establishes contract delivery or performance schedules. There's also a reference here, FAR 2.101, which is a regulatory definition for past performance, and references FAR 4.804. So, I read a presentation today that I'd seen that Dr. Doug Getz and Tom Ruckdash put together in 2013, I believe it was given, about it's not just FAR Part 45 or 52245-1. We have to go and look at other sections of the FAR there. And then as I also at the bottom of this, and for today's purpose of the discussion, is I'm going to look at the period of performance as time frame allowed or required for the performance to be completed. And do note, and I put it on here for you at the bottom of the slide, of what a termination inventory is. Is a contractor may annotate inventory disposal schedules to identify property the contractor wishes to purchase from the government in the event that the property is offered for sale. So again, more definitions for you there. So when we think of contract closeout, as we go to the next slide, what does physical inventory have to do with contract closeout? Well, as you can see here in 52245-1 under the physical inventory section, in the highlighted red font there, a final physical inventory shall be performed upon contract completion or termination. So shall, mandatory statement. However, as I've notated in the blue font below that, the PA may waive this final inventory requirement depending on the circumstances. So my question to the group to contemplate and over discussion as you move on throughout your day and throughout your career is, how do you go get that waiver from the PA? Do you formally do it? Do you have it documented in your processes? Do you want to do a full physical inventory at the contract completion? And that if you've just inventoried an item in January or February of this year, and now you're at contract completion in March, and do you want to go back and retouch it? I would hope not. Let's look for streamlined possibilities there. So then as I go to the next chart and look at disposition timelines, some very key timelines when we get into contract closeout. If you look at contract closeout, we're really going to talk about in 245-1, the submission requirements that are notated in that section under submissions of PCARs and inventory schedules, and particularly B and C as it relates to this information that we're sharing today. 60 days or such longer period as may be approved by the plant clearance officer. Again, if you're at contract closeout time, your period of performance has ended, you've got 60 days to get in the PCARs, which means you've got to have your physical inventory completed before that 60 days, or you've got to do some documentation to request waivers and request a longer period as approved by the plant clearance officer. Key person, the plant clearance officer. Hopefully they're working with your GPA and your contracting officers as well. So that's definitely for B once the period of performance there. What if you accidentally have to deal with a termination contract? Nobody wants to deal with a termination contract. We want them to be successful and delivered. But I've dealt with one, and it wasn't fun for sure, because we knew at a termination we had to go ask and work with not the plant clearance officer in this case, but the terminating contracting officer. So as you can see there, we changed people as to who we have to work with to request additional timelines to get it in. Because I can bet, for those of you on the webinar, if I asked the question and asked you to raise your hand, how many of you could put everything in PCARs within 60 days for standard contract termination or completion, or 120 days or sooner for a termination inventory? Not many is my guess. I know we certainly would struggle with it across some of our programs. There. So when I look at the next chart in property closeout process, and I really look to see when does it officially begin. Remember, it's primarily a contracts function. So we look for contracts direction, time to, quote, officially begin the contract property closeout process. Again, physical inventory. Do we have to plan and inventory everything remaining in the contract? Don't forget work in process, because you've got material that's been issued from a stockroom and is out on the floor. It's still accountable to the contract. So you have to make sure you do that. Do you request that waiver we talked about? Again, back to the definition, how, to whom, what if it's not granted? I would guess that most people don't document that correctly and have a complete auditable trail for when our PAs come in and do their assessments and their reviews of us as a contractor. So as I move to the next chart, the biggest thing is communication. It's key. You've got to coordinate with a lot of people in asset management and property management. You've got to coordinate with your line of business, your actual contract administrators, the property management program representative, if they have that, or the person that's in charge of the asset management overall. You've got to work with your plant clearance officer, your GPAs. I would recommend setting up regular status meetings with them on the customer agency, your PAs, your plant clearance officer, a technical program team lead. You know, what is all this used for? Can it be donated to a good cause? Can it be reutilized? Don't forget you've got pre-screening requirements. There's a lot that's got to go on in a very short amount of time, and if you're not communicating and you're working in a vacuum, you're going to get there. That coordination should begin prior to the end of the period of performance. So does your property management or asset management system have trigger points in there that tells you when an upcoming period of performance is coming due, whether it's going to get extended from a contracts perspective or if you're going to go do that and capture it all there? Next chart, Jessica, please. So this is, again, where contracts lead the way, right? We do at Lockheed Martin with a process of contract closeout operations directive for property. We receive that contract closeout program directive from the contract administrator, and then they turn over all the files to a central closure team there when applicable. Depends upon the program, of course, but that's how we look and do it. The contracts then tells us and asks us how long it's going to take. We do the estimates, we go get our approvals, we get our waivers as needed, and then we move forward there. Then property management, contract closeout timeline, summary, and I've given you a copy in the next slides, and I'll show you a couple of things of a tracking log of how we do it. But again, you've got to look at what your estimated times are going to be, how long is it going to take you. You know, don't just think you've got to, when you're doing a zero property cert at the end of, to say there's no property left in the contract, that you've got to account for all the timeline of how long it's going to be in PCARs. And we know there's no set time there. They've got their process. They try to get it closed out and the case is closed within 200 days, but that's a lot of activity and a lot of work. So make sure your timelines are reasonable and as best as accurate as possible. So if I go to the next chart, this is the property closeout tracking log. This is some information here. It's just notional data in there. I actually use some names in here that you may or may not recognize there, but we capture it of how long it's going to be, the status of it. We have a contract name, a contract number, and as you can see, I've just used the straight numbering, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. there. Who my property program rep is there, who the contract's point of contact would be, who issued that operations directive or program ID, the date that's on that. When did we receive it? When did my clock really start, right? And then when did we as property management start? Hopefully it's the same day. Maybe it's sooner in some cases. Then we give an estimate of how long it's going to take to complete all the activities. Again, not just submission into PCARs, which is your deadlines that you have out of the FAR, but also once you get that direction from the plant clearance officer back, how long it takes you to execute that. And then we track it, and I've got a simple calculation that runs of how many days that is, and that's where we get the red, yellow, green from. And then on the far column, you can see that we've properties completed, the final cert date is, and we certified to the contracts group, and you also have to provide that cert to your government property administrator. Some people don't do that, and if they're not doing it, they're missing a key step. Why do you have to provide it to a government property administrator, your contract closeout cert? The reason is the GPAs have an action that they have to do on their site. They have to go into MOCAS and update MOCAS, their system of record, to say that they've received a property cert from us as the contractor to flip that switch. So this is just an example that we've used and built and developed to track this. Just helps us there. We review it all the time as we're going through processes, period of performance. We're working with our contracts teams there as well. So as I go into the next slide, steps to ensure success for us. Obviously, when you get your contract OD, you're going to review your internal systems for property. Property is both, as we know, equipment and repair material. So you should check all systems which may contain property. If you've got multiple sites, may mean multiple systems. We have one program that we have that has 3 different systems because we are bound by contract on GOCO facilities and on bases to use their system versus our system. So we've got to check those systems there. We check the property equipment databases. We check all the material databases. We run reports that would give us a listing of all the equipment tied to the contract that's going into closeout, and then we start the closeout process for those. As I continue on to the next slide, what about work in process? We looked at that. Make parts, ordnance, key hazmat things that have to be done. You've got to make sure there. You may need to bring ASH into it, your environmental safety and health group there. Have that discussion with them. You've got to coordinate with the material planner or the controller to verify there's no whip or make parts in the system anywhere. You also have to make sure that from program management that they know across the board that there's nothing there. What about open purchase orders too? Make sure that's all captured. They accidentally had something that was a long lead item that never came, and there's an open purchase order. So please make sure you're checking all those systems, because you don't want something to show up and on the dock after your period of performance is ended. Determination of property at a subcontractor's location. Again, now you've got to work with the subcontractor. You've got to work with your subcontract community and your contract administrators for property at their suppliers. You've got to make sure you flow down direction contractually to the suppliers to begin contract closeout, especially if it's a termination inventory and a termination contract. And you should want, as the prime, 0 property certifications from your suppliers. So again, you can say everything that's accountable to the prime contract with the government has been closed out and off the books correctly. If I go to the next chart here, again, process property for disposition by completing the steps. Coordinate with your programs, your property coordinators, your material resource planners and controllers. Excess property gets to a surplus group or disposition services group. It's entered into PCARs or other systems for commercial contracts, classified programs, and other agencies that do not use PCARs. NASA, FAR supplement. Make sure you're following the contractual flow downs in there. Does your contract say don't enter it into PCARs and ship it back to them for certain pieces of equipment? Make sure you're looking at what your contract says. You've got to make sure everything is looked at across the board. Then, once you get it out of your equipment system, maybe it's in a different system of a disposition service system. Again, make sure that it's captured there, that they've closed all their records. Did you get disposition instructions to scrap it, to do a sale, return to customer, donate? All of that's got to be captured. And if you've got a sale going on, did you process all the checks correctly? Make sure that's closed. So you've got to keep track of the process and the progress to do that. As you go into the next slide here, Jessica, you'll get into my property management checklist. This is a checklist that we use as a program team from an asset management specialist to help streamline our operation. We build this for every contract going into closeout. We capture the Contract Closeout Operations Directive, or OD, contract number, reference numbers, the date it was received, the customer, agency, program manager, contract administrator. All of those are key personnel for us because, as we know, a lot of us, and like I mentioned in the very first slide in the description, people are going to leave their jobs and go on to other jobs because their contract is closing. So you need to know who the key players are that you can work with to get the information. Did you have property custodians or coordinators there? And again, as we move on to the continuation of that checklist, on the next slide, this is the systems that are checked, what records are closed, what POs are out there from the subcontract perspective. We capture all of that. This is just a snapshot of the template that we've used, and we can add in an Excel spreadsheet is all this is, and we just continue to add information and add rows to make sure we have a complete picture of everything that we're doing from an asset management perspective and tracking it there. Government furnished property list from contracts for other programs sources. Don't forget, what if you have crypto that you've got to worry about? You may not be tracking it in your standard property system, so if you work with security to make sure all the crypto's off the contract because you've got keys and whatnot. A lot of different systems you've got to look at. And then as I go to the next chart, we talk about final property reports. Again, this is where we at Space Systems Company deal with the NASA requirements. We also have other financial reports for other agencies and customers, our classified customers, our commercial customers. We capture all of that. And then we show in the next, at the bottom of that slide, the final property certification is issued and distributed and who it went to. Is it complete? The final date and the customer agency, that would be your GPA and your contracts person.
Greg, before we move on, I have a question that's been typed in real quick.
Sure.
Is there any change in the process if I am a sub instead of the prime contractor?
From my perspective, no. You should be getting direction from your prime directly, and then you're executing the same steps that you would for anything else unless your contract is different. So if I'm a sub to Boeing in some cases, Boeing issues me the direction, I've got to go off and issue my directions to my subs if I have a third-tier sub, or if I'm the only sole source sub on my side. I would still do the process the same.
Great, thank you.
You bet. Hope that answered it for everybody. So now if we go to the next chart, Jessica, it should be the completion of the final property closure certification. This is some checklist items that we do here as well. We validate that all loss reports are completed or closed through eTools. If you're using PCARs, again, you may have other groups and companies that use different loading mechanisms to capture that. You verify through the steps above that all the physical property is gone and the property records have been updated as appropriate. You complete the final 0 reports where required. You may not be required to on a commercial contract, but you still want to capture that it's closed correctly there. And we send it to a central closeout team because of the size of our company, and a copy to the GPA or other identified customer. Again, they have steps that they want to close to show that's been done, and you need to keep that on file. Make sure you're filing it. We create folders. We title the folder and subfolders with the program names and put it on a central SharePoint so it's not on some individual person's computer. I can tell you I recently, as last year, looked at a 32-year-old contract that we had provided the program cert to the GPA, but that person had retired, didn't update MOCAS, and we went back and had to reconcile MOCAS because we were trying to show everything was completed. The PA was doing a good job making sure it was the new one, and we went back and found it, and because it was on a central SharePoint site under our central SharePoint contracts group, we were able to do that very quickly and efficiently. So, one thing we also do is we mark the contract as closed in the property systems contract table. I don't want someone trying to build a new record on a property that's closed. So what does your system allow you to do to capture that you have a closed contract if it flags it? What if you have an item that was found, 3 years after the contract's closed, someone cleaned out a different closet or something, found a piece of property? What do you do with it? You don't want them just turning the record active and have an active record on a contract. So we've put systems and procedures in place to trigger to say, hey, red flag, now what do we got to go do? So make sure you're looking at that in your systems as well. Make sure you capture all the information, and closeout related documents have been validated as being in the appropriate program folder. Close the records in the contract closeout tracking log. That's our last step in that step. And then, again, when I look at the next slide, this is an example of what we send to our contract administrators, a DCMA. If it's not DCMA administered, no further actions. If it's DCMA administered, it's sent to the GPA or another customer agency. So this is just an example for you all to have. Feel free to edit accordingly and make sure you're capturing it, your final property certification. So I go back to the last slide that I have here today, and I ask myself again, property closeout, when does it really start? It really starts the first time you acquire or receive property on a contract. If you're not thinking about what you're going to do at disposition and how you're tracking it up to that point, you will not be as successful there. Disposition, when it becomes excess, make sure you have great utilization review processes in place. Don't let your engineers and your programs hold on to stuff just because. It's not only a violation and non-compliance in the FAR, it's also going to save you time and energy and effort when you get into contract closeout. So make sure you're doing it there. Define the trigger points that ensure effective utilization reviews. What do I mean by a trigger point? Let's say you have a piece of special test equipment that's out there. You run the test in week 5 of the program, and the program's supposed to run for another year. Once you do that test, have a way to check in your system to say, do I still need to hold on to it for another test later, or can I get rid of it in excess now? Put it in the disposition cycle. Again, it will save you time at contract closeout time. Don't be the hoarder. We know people do. Make sure that you try to minimize that. Less inventory at closeout equals less work at the end and saves money for the customer and you as a contractor, because you might be charging overhead to do all the contract closeout activities, where you might be able to charge the program direct, depending on what your disclosure statements and type of contract you have to do that. Make sure too, and I didn't put it on here, that what type of contract, I should have mentioned that earlier. Is it a cost plus reimbursable contract? What if it's a firm fixed price contract? Who owns the title once the deliverable's been done? Make sure you're looking at all of that as part of your asset management process and your procedures. Make sure you clearly spell it out. And again, think of disposition first, especially on a firm fixed price contract where, depending on what your contractual terms and obligations are, you may have all that property be your own company's property and not property of the government at the end of the contract because the deliverables been met. So how are you going to tag it, track it, etc. up front?